Good afternoon. Welcome to the Halifax Board of Police Commissioners for the Halifax Regional Municipality for its June 4th, 2025 meeting. Madam Clerk, can you confirm we have a quorum for today's meeting?
Chair O'Malley, I can confirm that we have quorum.
Thank you. So we'll do the call to order and land acknowledgement. The Halifax Regional Municipality is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. The municipality acknowledges the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognizes that we are all treaty people. Are there any community announcements? No. No community announcements. Moving on to number 3, approval of the minutes from our May 21st meeting. Can I have a call for approval of the minutes from our May 21st meeting? I need a mover and a seconder. Thank you, Commissioner Mancini and Commissioner Bezic-Escanlar. Thank you kindly. Are there any errors and omissions in the minutes that anyone observed? Barring none, we'll call for the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carried. Moving on to item number 4, approval of the order of business and approval of additions and deletions. Clerk, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda?
Chair O'Malley, there's no additions or deletions from the clerk's office.
Thank you kindly. Do the commissioners have any additions or deletions or modifications that they'd like to make to the order of business today? Thank you. Can we have a call for the motion to approve the agenda as presented? Thank you, Vice Chair Kent. Thank you, Commissioner Hinch. All those in favor of adopting the order of business? Motion carried. Thank you. An additional item, legislative or procedural item, with respect to item 8.3.1, we're having a presentation restructuring the crisis response models into civilian-led teams. Our policy requires a 5-minute time limit, but we have the option to extend that if the board so chooses. And I'd ask that if the board would be amenable to having a motion to extend the time for this particular presentation to 10 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I move that we extend the presentation to 10 minutes.
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Mancini. I think we do.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Call for the question. All those in favor of extending the meeting? All those against?
The mover should. Are you voting?
You going to vote?
I didn't see that nod.
Motion is carried. We've extended the time for the presentation. Thank you. Then that excludes questions, obviously, by board members and responses by the presenter. Is there any business arising out of the minutes?
Chair, no.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll call for a declaration of conflicts of interest. Commissioners, does anyone have a conflict of interest to declare as a result of an item on today's agenda? Barring none, thank you. There is no conflict of interest to make note of. Consideration of deferred business. Is there any deferred business, Madam Clerk? Thank you, Madam Clerk. Correspondence, petitions, and delegations. Is there any correspondence to note for 8.1.1, Madam Clerk?
Chair O'Malley, we did receive correspondence for item 8.3.1.
Thank you. Any petitions that we need to receive today?
The clerk's office did not receive any petitions for this meeting.
Okay. Any commissioners, do they have any petitions that they'd like to submit? Okay, thank you kindly. And we're going to move on to 8.3 then, presentations. And the first presentation is restructuring crisis response models into civilian-led teams. And we have Megan Rowe from Dalhousie University. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much.
Megan is a PhD student at the university working in this area, and I'm sure she'll share her area of research. Just a note, Megan, I don't know if you had the opportunity to present before, but typically the the presentations need to be narrowed to the focus of what the board's mandate is, and that they not involve anything related to, police specific matters, police conduct, any sort of complaint of any sort. So barring all that, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to start my timer. Thank you all so much for having me here today. My name is Megan Rowe, and I'm a social worker here in Nova Scotia and also an incoming PhD student at Dalhousie University. Today, I'm going to be presenting on some findings from a scoping review that my colleagues and I recently completed that looked at restructuring crisis response programs into civilian-led teams. And this work was done in partnership with the Eaton Lab as well as the Canadian Mental Health Association, and it's funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Before I begin, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge Chantal Moore and note that today marks 5 years since her life was taken during a wellness check back June 4th, 2020. Chantal was a 26-year-old Cleo Kwiat woman, a daughter, a mother, and a community member, and her life was taken far too soon. Okay, so I'll start my presentation by briefly situating the research within the context. I do want to note that this is theoretically and historically dense content that with a 10-minute limit, I won't have a ton of time to really kind of engage, but I'll do my best to sort of briefly situate it before discussing our findings. So policing mental health is a term that's been used and coined in the literature to refer to the use of law enforcement as the default response to crises involving mental health, substance use, situations of acute distress, and other related concerns. And policing mental health as a response system has been critically examined as being shaped by forces called sanism and racism. This is something that's been sort of engaged in critical mental health theories and engaged across different literature. Sanism is a form of ableism, and it involves negative attitudes and beliefs as well as actions toward those labeled or perceived as mentally ill, while racism is a form of power and oppression based on race. And sanism and racism have been found to intersect to shape how crisis situations are perceived by labeling distress as being always and inherently violent or threatening. And this is especially evident in how distress experienced by Black and Indigenous individuals is perceived. And ultimately, the idea that perceived threats of violence will always occur during distress has helped justify the involvement of law enforcement in responding to these situations, when in reality, it might be that they could be more appropriately addressed through healthcare providers or community-based services. So this is sort of, I guess, situating this theoretical content in some data. Data pulled from a Canadian database that tracks police-involved fatalities between the years 2000 and 2017 show that 68%, which is 377, of those killed were individuals experiencing acute distress or other mental health-related concerns. Black and Indigenous people were markedly overrepresented within these deaths. As I have here on the screen, Black people comprised 8.63% of deaths, while only representing 2.92% of the population, while Indigenous people comprised 16% of deaths, but only 4.21% of the population. Okay, so now kind of jumping into what we did, we conducted a scoping review, which is a method used to map all existing literature on a topic. So we took a highly exploratory approach. We wanted to understand how crisis response models are responding to some of the harms and being restructured into civilian-led teams. So civilian-led teams are an alternative non-police staffed crisis response model that are instead operated by trained unarmed personnel. And our scoping review included 46 sources, so it's an early but growing body of literature. And we focused heavily on exploring the development, implementation, and sustainability of these teams. Okay, so we identified 3 overarching themes. Again, these are kind of the key processes involved in the structuring or restructuring of crisis response models into civilian-led teams. And these were the themes that we pulled across our included literature. And I'll spend the rest of my allotted time discussing these themes in a bit more detail. So the first theme that we identified was decentering police in crisis response. And this overarching theme was identified by 39 sources. And it was highlighted as a core feature in structuring civilian-led crisis teams. In some cases, police services stepped back on their own, and then in others, this shift was facilitated by legislation or policy changes. And there were two key drivers that facilitated this. The first was this idea of a growing collective awareness, so a shift in public consciousness that recognizes the need for alternatives. And the second was establishing a distinct non-police care option within our crisis response continuum. As you can see on the screen, there really is like no universal standard right now for who comprises these teams. Instead, it's the distinct shift away from staffing police and towards staffing mental health trained personnel that was a common feature. So the next overarching theme was determining an operational framework for these teams. 32 sources discussed the importance of this, and two main kind of sub-themes emerged, which is navigating dispatch logistics, as well as defining response criteria. And I'll spend a little bit of time discussing these because they're two critical components. A big focus was on dispatch logistics, so how people actually access these teams. And there's still debate on what the most accessible or best option for this is. I know in Halifax, I believe it's 211 that was agreed upon. That's a common access point across other operated teams. Some teams are accessed through 911, so they're linked as sort of a fourth emergency service, so folks can call 911, and that can be an option for response right from the jump. That being said, there's debate around this linking, specifically the sense of supposed universal safety 911 offers has been found to not be universal amongst all community members. Another component is defining response criteria. So this essentially refers to the situations that these teams are situated to respond to, so their scope of practice. Dispatch officers are generally trained to identify a number of keywords that will determine whether a crisis team can respond or cannot respond. That being said, the literature suggests that some of these keywords, such as non-emergency crisis or non-violent crisis, lack transparent and definitive definitions. So ultimately, this presents a barrier, because specifically when we think of the idea of like a non-violent crisis and the limitations that this might pose, when we think of situations like intimate partner violence, for example, where there are complex dynamics like self-defense that don't necessarily fit into a neat binary of violent versus non-violent. It also leaves room for interpretation when we don't have clear guidelines on what constitutes violent versus non-violent. And finally, our last theme is team uptake and sustainability. So looking at the factors that support starting these teams, but also support making them last. So social and political will for alternative crisis response models is a key component to facilitating team uptake. We found that community advocacy can push governments to act, but political decisions like funding or public endorsements also shape how much buy-in these teams get from community. In some cases, the literature identified uptake hinges upon police being willing to champion these teams by navigating and collaborating a way of redefining their role in crisis response or stepping back. Ultimately, this is something that involves all key interest holders. It's a collaborative approach that involves service providers and law enforcement alike navigating a path forward. And finally, I know I'm short on time, resourcing was another component involved in team sustainability. So looking at funding, the literature emphasized the need for stable long-term funding, not short-term grants. Some literature discussed a reallocation of funding from police toward these teams. Other literature suggests additive models. Some suggest both, but the key kind of overarching idea here is that regardless of the source of funding, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be long term. And yeah, this, I guess, in terms of next steps, this was phase one of a broader study that our research group is working on. The next step is to take these findings, consolidate them, and synthesize them in a way that, can be translated to key interest holders. So we're looking to talk with police services across both Canada and the United States, as well as, community voices, community members, folks who have accessed these teams, service providers staffing them, to see how these findings can either be integrated in areas that have yet to explore alternative options, or how we can use these findings to continue to improve civilian-led crisis teams that are currently operating. Thank you. These are the references, and we have open access data, meaning you can see all of the literature we included. And the manuscript, of course, that's public domain. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before opening it up to questions for the commissioners, I just wanted to ask one simple question. Use the term decentering. I hadn't heard that before. Is that equivalent to a term that we'll frequently use, detasking?
It can be, yes. This one's more of I would say like a broader kind of theoretical term. The idea of like detasking, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I see as very kind of tangible, like actionable kind of things to detask. Decentering is sort of the idea of like severing the ties between criminal legal system and mental health fields that right now are very intertwined. And so this is an example of decentering police within one aspect of broader ties between criminal, legal, and mental health care systems.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Any commissioners? Vice Chair Kent?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for coming in, Megan. It's really good to hear about the kind of things that you're working on. So I have a number of questions. The main one is what brought this to you actioning in this way? I'm curious about what the precipitators were that brought you to engage in this. It's an important piece of work that you're doing, for sure, as you know, or would know, I think, that we on this board and the municipality have already started down the road of recreating a new crisis-led intervention piece and model. So, any kind of information that we can get is helpful. I wonder if so that's the first question was, I'll just leave you with a bunch of questions.
Okay.
Second one
Yeah,
is
write them
that, have you had a chance to have any conversations with our folks, and Dr. Amy Siciliano, who is here and has been doing much of the work, and our policing. I'm glad that in this particular work that you're doing has identified that the police also need to be the champions of these kinds of change. And we're pleased that we have that here. The last question I will leave you with is quite large. You're doing this work and you envision, can you look outward? And when you collect all the data that you need, what would you do with it then?
Thank you. Through the chair to the commissioner. Is that right? Thank you so much for your question.
That's great.
Thank you. Okay, I'll start with the first one. What brought us to doing this work? I guess for me personally, I graduated undergrad in 2020. So that was a big year with regard to a consciousness raising process regarding, policing and policing mental health, but I would say policing in the aggregate. At that time, I was working as a crisis responder for suicide-related crises. My undergraduate research focused primarily on exploring suicide risk. And through that role, I was a mandated reporter, which means I would contact police for sometimes consensual, but oftentimes non-consensual intervention for folks who were deemed to be high risk. That was sort of the first time, and recognizing the privilege that I hold in saying this, that the first time I ever started to consider the harms of that sort of process was back then after finishing undergrad. And so that's when I first started to engage in more critical social and legal theories in research and figuring out, okay, you know, we see the harms with regard to the ties between criminal, legal, and mental health systems, and how often, you know, we're very much embedded, like social workers work alongside police, and so how can we start to kind of decenter that or detach those ties? What are better ways, or adding options to our mental health care systems? What can that look like? And so that sort of led me into my master's thesis research program, which was a case study on civilian-led teams. And then that led me to partnering with Dr. Eaton and Dr. Lowe on this more broad study that spans, I mean, it was a scoping review, so really everything that's out there, and now kind of nationally looking at mental health care systems in Canada and the United States. The second question was if I've been in touch with
Yes.
local folks.
Yes.
No, and I want to be. I think, yeah, limitation on my part. Absolutely would love to connect. I think that that's going to be a major focus of my doctoral research program. Now that I'm here in Halifax for the longer term. I mean, I moved here from Montreal 2 years ago and wasn't really sure what my next steps would look like. Was involved in this research, which is pretty vast. Would love to narrow it down to local, especially given the second part of this research program, which is engaging service providers and key interest holders. And we have a pretty vast definition of who would constitute a key interest holder. And finally, yeah, on the knowledge translation piece of these findings and what we do with them, I think a lot of it, and at least for me, and I can speak likely on behalf of my colleagues, a really important piece is hearing community voices. Like, we want to hear the people who are using these teams, what they would like to see with the development of any alternative or new models. So yeah, I would love to engage community in every step of the way. I would like to hear, you know, their thoughts on our findings. And I think that's something that we're looking to do. So what we're planning on doing is taking the findings from this scoping review, as well as another one that we created or that we completed that looked at co-responder teams. We're looking to turn them into like accessible, easy to read, simple, plain language infographics that can be distributed widely. And that's something that CMHA is helping facilitate, just given their reach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Megan, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for the presentation. I think it's extremely timely to hear about your presentation. You know, in these chambers over the last number of years, we've heard a lot about defunding police, which I never agreed with. And to this day, I still don't agree with. I do believe in detasking, and that makes sense. And I believe our two police forces believe in that too. But, you know, Megan, you're new to our community, but here, maybe like other communities, you know, we realize crisis doesn't just happen between 9 to 5. And unfortunately, police are the folks that are there to respond 24/7, 9 to 5. So, you know, I'm very glad that we are now launching our own civilian-led team under the Dr. Siciliano and Commissioner Moore, and that's just happening right now. And we're very excited about that. It's a direction that I'm personally very proud of. I wear two hats as an elected official and a commissioner. You know, interesting watching your three pillars, because Dr. Siciliano just gave us a presentation at our last meeting. And, you know, in that presentation, we talked about the non-police response, thus this team that we're creating. Dispatch logistics she spoke about. It lined up quite well for what you talked about, and using 211. And, you know, interesting about what's kind of jumped up for me was your comments about the situation and where things fit. You know, the non-violent and the non-emergency piece. So I think that's something I would like to, Dr. Siciliano, look at you. I'd like to explore further where that is with us and how we make that determination. Do we send this left or do we send this right, and making sure we're sending it to the right team? And also then the last pillar that you talked about, the political will. We have the political will in the city. And so, and when it comes to resources, and I have my colleagues here, making sure that those resources are upheld and supported. So that's just my preamble to get where to my question here. One, I would love you to connect with Dr. Siciliano. We haven't met Dr. Siciliano front row right here. We're very proud of her work, and we're pleased to have her. So hopefully you guys can chat. I gave her a call yesterday, and she said, "Oh, I read her work." So she's already doing her homework. So if you guys can connect, that is part of the reason why I invited you to come here.
Thank you.
So here's my question. Sorry about that, Mr. Chair. He was kidding about me. I'm being the long-winded one on the chambers, but I know you're not really maybe as familiar with our civilian-led team that we are launching right now, but what would your suggestions be to us, not knowing the details of our team, that we should be really looking at based on your research? What are some of the things, maybe it's when you did your research, you saw mistakes happen, or maybe there's some points of success that are really critical in what you've seen in your research?
Through the chair to the commissioner, thank you so much for all of that, and absolutely would love to connect. And thank you for your question. I think a really key piece when it comes to civilian-led crisis teams that's come up in this research, and then also other research programs I've been involved in that I can speak to, is the need for transparency with the folks that we are working with regard to the team's link to police. So being very clear that, this is a non-police staff team, but that doesn't mean that it won't be escalated into a police response if needed. I think that's really important for people to know, for the sake of, a truly consensual response. They need to know transparently when, how, what that will look like. I think also, on a more speaking from a social worker, knowing or letting folks know about how case notes will be used, what information's being collected, being really transparent. This promotes a trauma-informed response. It makes it as consensual as any sort of intervention can be, especially given that we're working within systems that oftentimes will remove folks of autonomy in moments of crisis due to the biases that kind of uphold the field that I briefly mentioned at the start of this presentation. So yeah, I would say utmost transparency with regard to link to police, what information will be gathered, how that will be used, who it will go to, coinciding with the person-first approach that the team champions.
That's very helpful. Again, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Really
Thank
appreciate your time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And over to Commissioner Bezic-Escanlar, who is a physician and who has a great interest in this subject area.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for doing the talk. I have a great interest, but as it turns out, my two colleagues here had taken my questions. So I will just simply say that as a relative newcomer to Halifax as well, I think this is a really exciting time for these initiatives. The political will is there. The will from the police forces is there too, to make sure that Haligonians are getting the right service at the right place at the right time. It's good for everyone to do this, and by informing our decisions with the research that you've done and the work that Dr. Siciliano has done and the work that Commissioner Moore is doing on the public safety side, I think we're on the right track. So thank you very much.
Thank
Looking forward to
you.
working with you. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Hinch?
Hey, Meg. Thank you so much for this presentation. So one of the things that are the statistics that you guys came up with, I assume that's across Canada?
Yes.
It's across Canada, yes. And the percentages that you came up with, which were kind of quite disturbing to me, to be honest with you, 8.63% of the deaths for Blacks and 16% for the Indigenous groups. I mean, what can we do? What can we do as a board to help facilitate or help you to reduce those numbers, for one thing, and to what I'm trying to understand, what are your let's say pros and cons, that type of thing, or is there anything that we can do to support you to reduce these numbers? That's what I want to know.
Through the chair to the commissioner, thank you. I think that's a really important question, and I absolutely agree. The numbers are jarring, and yeah, they're telling. I think they're telling of a system that is built up on historic and theoretical context that disproportionately links or conflates acute emotional distress with violence, and this is compounded with race. So the distress of Black and Indigenous people is seen as more threatening, more inherently violent. I think part of it is recognizing and naming that this is like a system level. It's not an individual officer showing up to a scene necessarily. This is, so I think that's part of it. And I think, equally too is turning the gaze on social work and the mental health field, like this policing mental health and what we call carceral mental health care practices that result in these deadly force outcomes. It is a dual sort of, I guess, what's the word, responsibility of criminal, legal, mental health. I think interrogating these forces, naming them, recognizing that they're there rather than shying away from is part of it. And then I think also, taking steps toward alternatives that respond and recognize the harms. So for example, championing non-police options for acute distress. I think that's the first step. I think also being very critical of the options that we're implementing. So not jumping to civilian-led teams as the be-all end-all, being critical about the harms they might pose, especially when we have clinicians on these teams who hold a certain level of power and privilege over folks in distress. I think that's equally part of it. It's not seeing this as, the answer. I think it's a step. I think it's a great step at that, but I think always having that critical lens in tune, especially as we evaluate, the implementation and ongoing operation of these teams across all jurisdictions that have implemented them. Thank you.
Thank you. I also feel that, with the data that you have in front of me with regards to the Black and Indigenous, having people of Black descent or Indigenous descent in these spaces to help support these crisis-led teams is a big thing that we should be looking at as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'll just ask you one question if you don't mind. I'm kind of curious in your canvas